Hi, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. I am Obada, the president of Brunel Students for Palestine, and we have also here Monty, the vice president of Students for Palestine. And yeah, so Monty is going to explain us about the event.
Hello, everybody. Today, as you all know, we're joined by the incredible Dr. Ghada Karmi, who we're more than honored to host. She'll be giving us a brief recap on the history of Palestine and giving us an insight into her direct experience with the ongoing Nakba. Once the talk is complete, we'll be holding a Q&A where you'll be able to ask our special guest any questions you may have. So please, if you come up with any questions during the talk, note them down ready to ask when we open up the Q&A. You can drop this down on whatever platform you're using to watch our broadcast.
Okay, so I'm gonna welcome Ghada.
Hello, good evening.
Hi, good evening, Ghada. So, Ghada Karmi is a former research fellow at the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies and a former lecturer at the University of Exeter. She was born in Jerusalem, Palestine, and was forced to leave her home with her family as a result of Israel's creation in 1948. The family moved to England, where she grew up and was educated. Dr. Ghada practiced as a doctor for many years, working as a specialist in the health of migrants and refugees. She held several research appointments on Middle Eastern politics and culture at the School of Oriental and African Studies and in the universities of Durham and Leeds. She is also the author of different books. We have Return, a Palestinian Memoir, Married to Another Man, The Ethnic Health Handbook, The Palestinian Exodus, and In Search of Fatima. And she has also written in newspapers and magazines, including The Guardian and The Nation.
Thank you, Abada. What an incredible bio. So, Dr. Rada, can you please tell us what are the events that led to the 1948 Nakba and how was the UK involved in these decisions? Please account your own experience as a Palestinian who's been exiled and your journey ever since. Also, how do we, as the international community or allies of the cause, help further the cause? And within that, recently Amnesty recognized Israel as an apartheid state. What does that mean for us? Thank you so much. We're excited to hear what you have to say.
Okay, first of all, good evening to everyone. I don't know who's watching this, but greetings to you. And I'm very grateful for the opportunity to be able to talk about this terribly important subject. Palestine, the Palestine issue, the Palestine cause is really an epic cause. It's not just the story of a small people, the Palestinians, and the problems that they had. It now represents, if you like, a paradigm of injustice, of the striving of people to against the injustice and to make something of their lives. This story of heroism and suffering, we cannot deny that it's a story of suffering, but people coming through it and trying to make a success of their lives is inspiring. I don't say that just because I'm a Palestinian, but because the anywhere where you have a people facing a multiplicity of enemies that they really can't fight, they haven't got the power to fight, that always makes one understand how important the human spirit is, and that you can't actually, in the end, destroy people's longing for justice and for a decent life. Okay, so in my own case, I came from what you might call an ordinary family, really, living in Jerusalem. I was born in Jerusalem before there was an Israel. And the country I was born in was called Palestine, and it had been Palestine for thousands of years. Now, as a child, I expected, as any normal child, to have the sort of life where you go to school, you come home, your mum is at home, you have brothers and sisters, and then in time you graduate, you go up to a university, and then you get a job, get married, and eventually you die and you are buried in the country in which you were born. That is the expectation and the pattern of millions of people in this world. It is not the pattern of Palestinians, because when, as I say, I was a child, very much taking for granted that I had this life ahead of me, I soon found myself the victim of a drive to expel my family and me and all the people I knew out of our homes and out of our country. That was bad enough, but we then began to understand that we couldn't go back, because that is just as bad as being expelled. You can leave your home for any number of reasons, and you think to yourself, well, that's all right. I'll come back home. Not in the case of the Palestinians. When we lost our homes, when we were expelled or fled because of the terror of that time, we then found out, to our horror, that we weren't going to go home. It was not going to be allowed. And that really is, in essence, if you like, the story of the Palestinians. Just one gets hold of these fundamental facts. It's not a complicated story. We were thrown out. We lost our homes for one reason and one reason only. We were the wrong race. We were the wrong ethnicity. A group of people from Europe decided that they wanted our country and that it belonged to them. And people like us, who are not part of that group, had to go. That is the essence of apartheid as it affected us, even at that time. Now, in our own case, and so many hundreds of thousands of others, finding themselves, having left their homes, had to look out for themselves. And the story of my family was not typical, in the sense that most Palestinians who were expelled at the same time as us ended up either in refugee camps or as exiles in the countries around Palestine, which had now become Israel. That's what really happened to the majority. A small minority to whom we belonged went much further afield. And you've got to imagine that in those days, people didn't have a choice. They didn't sit there and think, oh, I'd like to work in Venezuela, or I'd like to try my hand in Germany. It wasn't like that. You had to take the jobs that you could find, because otherwise you and your family starved. It was like that. It was completely stark. Now, as I say, in our particular case, we went to England, to London, because my father had found a job there. And from then on, I have lived in this country from that time on. Now, the reason I'm telling you my story is because it really does help to explain to you the history of this conflict. Therefore, from having been expelled, finding ourselves as refugees, we had to look for somewhere where we could live, where we could work in order to survive. So it really was like that. Now, as I say, in my own case, it happened to be England. It might not have been. It could have been other countries. But it was England. And so I grew up knowing that we were not English, knowing that my country had been taken over by other people, and that I could go there to visit, but I could never return there to live. Very hard, very hard that. However, because of, you have to study, you have to get on, you can't sit there constantly weeping or regretting. It's not possible. That's not life. Now, in my own case, as I say, I went to university. I found myself qualified as a doctor of medicine, and I worked as such. Now, at a certain point, that, if you like, fairly typical middle-class story, you could say, of a family whose children go to university and who have a reasonable standard of living. Now, in the Palestinian case, I would say to you that people like me didn't go on living the typical life of a middle-class person in a middle-class family, because our country, Palestine, always remained in our consciousness. And because of what Israel was doing to the Palestinians, those who were left behind, who stayed behind in what was now Israel, we could not pretend to ourselves that it was nothing to do with us. It very much was to do with us. And I can tell you that, what was I? I was a junior doctor and supposed to be very pleased about being a junior doctor, looking forward to a more senior position. But, I couldn't forget where I'd come from and what had happened to that country and what was still being done to that country. So I became an activist for Palestine in the 1970s, when none of you were born. I became an activist. Naturally, I went on working, but the rest of my time was spent trying to promote the Palestine story, to tell people what had happened. Because you've got to understand, in this country, the Zionist story was the only story in town. Nobody knew or understood or cared about the Palestinians. And the fact that there would never have been an Israel had it not been for the role of a government of this country that we are now living in, which played a pivotal, extremely important role in bringing about the tragedy which I and so many others lived. I'm talking, of course, about the Balfour Declaration, which I think many of you know about, but not everybody maybe. And this very, very strange declaration was passed by a previous British government in 1917, and whereby the Foreign Secretary of the time, Lord Balfour, promised a Zionist representatives that they could make something called a Jewish home, a Jewish home in Palestine. So the declaration told these Zionists to let other Jewish Zionists know that the government of this country would support the creation of a home for, quote, the Jewish people in Palestine. And the rest is history, as you can imagine, because that home, in inverted commas, became a state with British assistance. and with lots of money coming in from all over the world, so that by 1948, the Zionists had learned how to set up a state. They had an army of their own, they had funding, they had arms, and were ready to take over the country. That is what the Nakba is. 1948, when the Zionists, the Zionist army expelled or terrorized Palestinians into fleeing. That is the Nakba, the great exodus out of the homeland, which, as I say, was never to be reversed, up until now anyway. So in trying to give you some kind of landmarks in this story, you need to bear in mind that there would never have been something called the State of Israel had it not been, first, for the British, the British government, which helped them. There would never have been a State of Israel had the British administration in Palestine, because remember, Palestine was ruled by the British. So the Palestinians didn't stand a chance, really. Now, the British administration in Palestine helped the Zionists to set up institutions of state, helped them to acquire an army, trained the army, and protected them from the anger of the indigenous Palestinian population, which could see what was happening. Their country was being taken over. So they protested. They often became violent. They tried everything. But the Zionists were protected throughout by the British and by the British army. So without that, there would never have been an Israel. But the second event in this story, without which there certainly wouldn't have been an Israel, is the Holocaust in the Second World War. By the 1940s, quite a lot of European Jews had immigrated into Palestine and were being prepared for all the activities that they'd have to do once they'd taken over the country. But believe me, by the 1940s, the early 1940s, there weren't enough Jews to make that happen. There weren't enough Jews. So had there been no Second World War, had there been no Holocaust, there would have been no Israel, because the minority of Jews that were in Palestine by the 1940s would not have been added to by Jews fleeing from Nazi persecution. So when the Holocaust happened, the whole of Europe and the United States very much supported Israel, very much supported the idea of a state for Jews in Palestine. Why? Because so many Jews had lost their homes, were displaced by Nazism. And this is the second bit you absolutely need to understand and remember. So, one, the Germans, by their actions, by the Nazi movement, had caused a flight of Jews. Two, neither Europe nor the United States wanted them. They held a conference in 1938 in which, when Nazism was already very strong, in which the European states and the United States talked about openly how many Jews they'd be prepared to take from Germany. Hardly nobody wanted them. They certainly took a small number. They didn't want them, and particularly in the United States. So you can understand, with that in mind, how convenient it was that there was this country, Palestine, in which the British had already prepared the groundwork for a Jewish state. How convenient. Then all the displaced, the refugees from Nazism, could go there. And that was just fine. They didn't have to receive so many of them. They did receive some, but I mean, it wasn't in the numbers that actually happened. They went to Palestine. Highly convenient. So, but for the Holocaust, what I'm saying is, so there would never have been an Israel had it not been for the British, the Balfour Declaration, and then the Second World War. However, there we are. The Second World War, that it did happen, and the State of Israel was set up. Now then, back to my own story, and as I told you, I became an activist because I really don't feel that any Palestinian with the slightest feeling and memory could have stopped themselves fighting to get Palestine back. And that is, in essence, what we were trying to do. Well, time passed. Israel was getting stronger, was getting more established throughout the 1950s. It was being armed by France and by the United States, and it acquired nuclear weapons in the 1950s, which were provided by the French. So in that time, Israel not only consolidated itself and got stronger, it also expanded its population by inviting in Jews from all over the world, including the Arab countries, from all over the world, encouraged them to come and take over the places and the property and the lands and the farms of the Palestinians. Israel began to grow in strength by yearly, really. Now, the end of the defeat of the Germans meant that the German government made reparations for what they had done to Jews. And this is something you also need to note. To make reparations to what was done to Jews, the German government decided to pay the Israeli government because there was an idea that Israel represented all Jews and would be the right place to go to if you wanted to compensate anybody who was Jewish. A big fallacy. Nevertheless, that's what happened. I mean, the fallacy is not that you make reparations. The fallacy is that you make them to Israel. And that's what happened. A lot of money flowed from Germany in reparations for the Holocaust. Now, with all this going on, in the 1960s, 50s, 60s, people forgot about the Palestinians. You know, who were they? They were refugees. And so people talked about them as Arab refugees. But then in the 1970s, the Palestinians themselves decided that it could not go on. And in 1964, the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO, was established. And the chairman was Yasser Arafat, which you also know. And the PLO then became the representative of the Palestinian people. And I can tell you that for me and everybody else in exile, we looked to the PLO to represent us. We admired the PLO. We all wanted to work for it. We all felt we belonged to it. Well, that was all a long time ago, unfortunately. Didn't last. And Israel grew stronger and stronger. And after the 67 war, when it took over, if you like, the rest of Palestine, remember that by 1948, the Zionists took over 78% of Palestine. By 67, they took over the rest. And at that moment, you got this idea of an occupation, the occupied people, the occupied territories. That's what it means after the 67 war. Meanwhile, the PLO was growing in strength and determined to liberate the homeland. However, Israel too strong. Israel was too supported, was too strongly backed by the international community. Very difficult for the Palestinians. Anyway, I want to try and curtail this because I'm aware that time is passing, and I don't know whether my host should tell me how much longer you want me to go on talking like this. Can you give me an idea?
Yes, we don't have a specific time, so
Okay,
as
so
long as you're comfortable with it.
fine. So we'll go on telling the story, and then when it comes to an end, I hope people will very welcome to ask questions. Anyway, so there we were in the 1970s with a very strong PLO, a lot of hope on the part of Palestinians, the refugee camps where so many Palestinians ended, in Lebanon particularly, but in Syria and in Jordan, was so encouraged by the existence of the PLO. This is a story you won't hear very often because it's a Palestinian story. What you hear is about Israel. But I'm telling you the Palestinian story. And I'm telling you that the PLO recruited its fighters from the refugee camps. And it's very important to understand that. It was an organization very much attached to the refugee camps, to the people who had been so disenfranchised and whom everybody had forgotten. Not anymore. They became fighters, they became officials in the PLO. The PLO established health clinics, schools, training centers in the camps. Although many international organizations were already there, particularly UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, which was set up to look after the Palestinian refugees, the PLO acted alongside, and for a while, there was a tremendous feeling of unity amongst all of us. The people, all the Palestinians in the Gulf, who'd fled to the Gulf and had made reasonable lives and had made money, they all contributed financially to the PLO. And we, much further afield, in this country, in the United States, in Europe, just felt it was all going to happen soon. There we were together. And we had our own organization. We had our chairman. We had our fighters. We could be proud. And it was going to happen. Well, sadly, it did not happen. What did happen was that Palestinian refugees, the PLO was expelled first from Jordan and then in 1970, and then in 1982, the PLO, which had the most important, it had its most important headquarters in Lebanon, it was expelled again, 1982, and ended up in Tunis, far away from where the action was, and it really was a very desperate time. So in the 1980s, it was a time when Israel had become established in the 1967 territories. It was building settlements. It was introducing Jews to settle the places in the West Bank, in Gaza. And Israel was constantly backed by the Western world. You remember I said there would never have been an Israel at all without Britain and then without the German Holocaust, but Israel would never have continued without Western backing, Western money, Western arms. And that continued throughout the time until today. Sometimes I ask myself, what does Israel have to do to stop being backed by these Western governments? Apparently, it can do whatever it likes. And so in the 1980s, where were we? In the 1980s, the Palestinian movement, the PLO, made a decision that the goal of total liberation of the homeland, which we all believed in and which we all supported, was no longer realistic. Israel was too strong. It's too strongly supported. We had no friends who could really have helped us to overcome Israel. We couldn't do it on our own. So the leadership of the Palestinians, the PLO, took a decision. And that is the origin of the so-called two-state solution. They took a decision. They said, look, maybe we can start with, we can set ourselves up in the 67 territories. Now, the 67 territories, what we call today the West Bank, Gaza, these form 20% of the original Palestine. So it was a big climb down for the Palestinians. But nevertheless, the leadership thought, okay, it's not much, but let's get it. And at least we can live to fight another day. That was their thinking. Now, they didn't say that openly. They said, we will aim for a Palestinian state in the 67 territories. And we will recognize Israel in 78% of Palestine. We recognize it. It would like it to recognize us and our right to set up our own state. That was in 1988. Well, of course, Israel took no notice. It had absolutely no intention of recognizing anything to do with the Palestinians. So it didn't work. It didn't work. It was a very great sacrifice, for the Palestinians to accept the loss of their homeland, 78%, to an enemy, and be satisfied with 20%, 22%. But that wasn't good enough for Israel. Israel wouldn't have nothing to do with it. So that takes us up to 1993. In 1993, that is the date of the so-called Oslo Accords, which I think you might have heard of. The leadership, again, Yasser Arafat and the people around him, made a further decision. They could see that even the acceptance of 20% of Palestine was not going to get anywhere with Israel. So they made another offer. Let's try and come to an agreement with you, Israel, and let's see if we can at least try and do something with the 67 territories, even though it's not a state now. And at that moment, Israel was perfectly happy to talk to the PLO, and that was Yitzhak Rabin, the prime minister of Israel at the time. And so you had this international agreement called the Oslo Accords. And what it amounted to was that in return for the Palestinians recognizing Israel and its boundaries, Israel recognized the PLO, did not recognize the claim to statehood of the Palestinians, did not recognize anything else about them, just that the PLO was their representative and they could talk to the Palestinians through the PLO. And at that moment, various agreements were drawn up, which enabled Yasser Arafat and the leadership to go back to Palestine. And they went to Gaza and a couple of places in the West Bank were freed up by the Israeli army. The Israeli army moved out, and that was Gaza and Jericho. And then with the idea that more and more towns and Palestinian cities would be freed up. But, and that, by the way, this whole subject of Oslo would be another lecture. I'll try and be as brief as I can. You see, the problem, of course, as always, in dealing with Israel, was that Israel too strong. It really did what it always wanted to do. It continued to colonize the West Bank and Gaza and set up settlements. And there was not a thing the Palestinians could do about it. They, in return for them getting some of their towns back and their cities back, the Israelis took as much land as they wanted, and that went on. That went on throughout the 1990s, and any number of negotiations were taking place between the Palestinians and Israel to try and stop and halt, from far as the Palestinians were concerned, to halt this colonization, to try and stop it. Never stopped. It never stopped. It hasn't stopped to this day. And by the time we're coming up to our age, our part of the story, most of Palestine's land has gone into Israeli ownership, leaving some 7% of, over 60% of the West Bank is in Israeli hands. And that is diminishing by the day as Israel takes more and more land and sets up many more settlements. These are the settlements you hear about. So you now have 600,000 Jewish settlers in what was to be the 1967 state for the Palestinians. It's full of Jewish settlers. And the Palestinian position has become weaker and weaker. Now, the Oslo Agreement, I need to tell you something about the Palestinian Authority. The Oslo Agreement set up something called the Palestinian Authority. That was a sort of government for the Palestinians in the 67 territories. That is the one you hear about, the head of which is Mahmoud Abbas, and then you hear something about that. That's what that is. It was set up as a result of Oslo. And it is the negotiating partner with Israel. Now, I'm sure you're thinking, clearly from the story I've told you, this is a bit of a charade, isn't it? You can't, whatever you want to call yourself, you can't really negotiate with your colonizer. That's what it is in the end, you know. So the Palestinian Authority is subservient to the Israeli government. And therefore, and the idea that you can negotiate like that is a bit of a joke, really. So we do actually have to be clear what we're talking about here. So what can I tell you? Today, we have a very difficult situation. We have a Palestinian Authority which has no authority and is not strong and cannot actually make much of a difference. And we have a Palestinian people in the occupied territories who have been parceled and divided and fragmented into small zones. And we have Gaza, which is under siege since 2007. A very, very serious situation for the people of Gaza. Now, I'm not sure really what more I should say, as opposed to any of you wanting to ask questions. You might want to know, for example, where all this is going. What is the aim in the end? What is you see, there are two questions: is what is likely to happen and what should happen. Now, I will tell you without any hesitation that what should happen is that the current Israel, which now includes the whole of Palestine, should become a democratic state for all the people who live there, Palestinians, Jewish Israelis, and anybody else. That is what should happen. In that way, you can have, there's no occupation, there's no colonization, there is a proper state with citizens composed of all the people who live there. And that state would then facilitate the return of all the people expelled from the country in 1948 and subsequently. That's what should happen. Israel will do its best to make sure that that never happens. Nevertheless, we always have to look at principle, sound politics, sensible policies. It's all of these mean that you have to have a democratic state. They mean you cannot go on with an aggressive Israel which practices apartheid against the Palestinian people and which steals their land and goes unpunished. That is what should not be going on. So really, it remains for me to say that we need a unified vision, and that unified vision needs to be what I've just talked about: the one democratic state. That is the only way forward. So I welcome any questions, comments, anything you'd like to talk about.
Basically, I have seen an article on Middle East Eye, and that you have written, and why the Palestinians should demand the Israeli citizenship to, liberate Palestine.
Yeah, what's the question?
Like why the Palestinians should demand the Israeli citizenship, and like how can this benefit them, and
Right.
like the final goal.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I need to explain that to people. I do explain it in the article, actually, but I will explain. At first sight, there's me saying what now needs to happen is for Palestinians under occupation to demand Israeli citizenship. And at first sight, lots of Palestinians would say, my God, no way, why we want citizenship of this dreadful state, etc., etc. Now, let's go back to the goal, the aim that I was talking about. The goal is a democratic state of citizens from both parties, Jewish Israelis who are already there, and Palestinians under occupation who are also there, but they're being ruled by Israel in an apartheid system. So what should happen is that everybody should get together and form this democratic state. Now, I'm not the first to have said that. Many people believe in the one democratic state idea. There are various groups and organizations which are trying to promote it and trying to push it, trying to work for it. Well, that's great. But you see, you've got to ask yourself the question, how do you get there? Yes, we're all agreed that the democratic state is the end point, let's say. But how do you get there? How? Do you go on working and making groups and having conferences and meetings and talking about it and writing about it and trying to influence decision makers? Yes, because you can do all that. How long do you reckon that would take? And how long do you think will it take Israel to take over the whole of the land that is left in Palestine? These are things that one has to bear in mind, because if you want to be politically conscious and politically active, you've got to deal with what is on the ground, not just what is in your head. It's from that perspective that I have worked out that the quickest way to the end point will be via citizenship for the Palestinians, in company with all the rest of the citizens Israel rules. Now, once you become a citizen of a state, then you start to have some influence. You're not going to have any influence from outside, however many groups you make and however many speeches you make or books you write. You will really get the way forward once you are a citizen, because it's like saying you're a member of a club, and as a member, you can influence the rules of the club and what the club does, etc., etc. Whereas if you're a non-member from outside saying, I don't think this club is good, I think we need to change the club, who's going to take any notice of you? So really, it's from that point of view. And I have therefore put forward the idea very seriously that if the Palestinians, who are now currently ruled by Israel without any rights, please understand that Israel rules over all these people. There is no independent state, Palestinian state. There is one country, Palestine, and the ruler is Israel. And Israel rules its own citizens and it rules the Palestinians. But the difference is that it rules one set of people who have rights and another set of people who have no rights. So that currently the Palestinians in the West Bank and in Gaza have no citizenship. They are stateless. You've got to actually bear that in mind. They have no rights. They are not citizens of anywhere, and they are stateless. Now, the fact that Israel can actually do that is pretty shocking anyway. You know, how come this state can go around ruling a whole set of people without giving them any rights whatsoever? Think about that. That's really, it's not acceptable. So I reckon, you see, it's up to the people that Israel rules to say, hang on, you're ruling us. You're doing all kinds of things that you want. But we don't have any say in any of this. We have no say in the way we are being governed. So we have a very simple question for you. Either you give us citizenship, like everybody else that you're ruling, or get out of our land. You see, it's a very simple question. It's very simple to understand. And that's really what was behind my idea.
Yeah, and there was a question related to this. So they say, how can Palestinians get an Israeli citizenship? Israel does not permit this at the moment, even the ones that are under threat of losing their Israeli citizenship.
Good question. Of course. I mean, I'm talking about only what the Palestinian side should be doing. I can't control the Israeli side, and I certainly am not in a position to force Israel to, confer citizenship. So therefore, bearing that in mind that is the case, doesn't stop me from raising the question. It doesn't stop me from campaigning for it. Now, I happen to believe, so it's not a question that you go to Israel and say, look, I need to become an Israeli citizen, they say, all right, very welcome, ahlan wa sahlan. Of course, it's not going to be like that. But what is our responsibility on this side would be to state clearly that we cannot go on being ruled without rights, and that we demand rights, and we demand the rights of citizenship. Otherwise, we cannot go on like this. Now, this is the start of a campaign. This isn't one of those things where you say, all right, well, then we'll ask for that and it'll happen. It's not. You have to fight for it. But at least with this, you're fighting for something which has a clear end point. It's not something vague like, quote, justice, or, quote, freedom, or the two-state solution, which is never going to happen. You have a very clear case, which you put to the world. You have to. Palestinians have not been clever about this, you know. They haven't. They've very often hoped that the rightness of their case would get through to people. Well, it's not like that. You have to push, and you have to state what it is you want, and you have to talk about how unfair it is. Now, we talked about, somebody mentioned the Amnesty report. You need to use it. The Amnesty report is brilliant. It makes clear that Israel is ruling over a people against whom it discriminates, that it treats as no citizens, as low class, as nothing. So you take that and you say, yeah, and we're not going to have it. We don't accept it. And we want you, all you activists, all you solidarity people, if you care for us, help us to get our rights. And I mean by right, our rights. I am not talking about another of these vague, nice sounding things. I'm talking about something very specific. Help us to get citizenship of the state. The state is powerful. It's ruling us. It's, we need help. So if you like, it needs to be the starting point in a campaign. You have to campaign and you have to work for the result that you want.
Thank you so much for the answer and for the talk. It was really useful and a lot of thought-provoking ideas. I do have a question. You mentioned the convenience of relocating the Jews to Palestine in the original relocation to Palestine. And I always get a question of, what does America and the UK get from funding Israel now? Now that they got rid of them and everything, what are they getting that they're constantly funding them and putting so much money that they could use for their own nationals?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, terribly good question. Something we've all asked. What does any country, well, what does any country get out of supporting Israel? What? Really, what? And it's really, believe me, I wish I had a ready answer. It's a very peculiar state of affairs. Now, it's not that people have not provided explanations and ideas, they have. And let me just try and review what people have said. First of all, in the United States is the strongest backer, as you know, of Israel. Now, you need to realize that other countries, smaller countries, would fear the displeasure of the United States, so they also go along with it. That's one motive for them. In Germany's case, we do understand that there is a tremendous historical guilt about what what a German movement, the Nazis, did to Jews, to German and Austrian and Polish and European Jews. So there is this specific feeling of guilt and responsibility. So it's not a question of what can we get out of it. It's something we have to keep doing because we keep apologizing. So that's them. And you have a variety of situations like this. Now, you've also heard that Israel Israel's surveillance industry is very useful for these Western states, that they use spying techniques, drone technology, all this kind of industry is useful to them, and they buy it from Israel. So, if you like, they want to keep Israel well supplied, well funded, in order for it to continue to do research in this field. Now, lots of questions, of course, occur to one when you hear something like this. You ask yourself, you immediately say, "Oh, really? So is Israel is the only state in the world that can come up with clever surveillance techniques?" The answer is, of course, not. It's not true. India, for example, there are many other states. If you give them enough funding, they've got the scientists, and they'd be able to do it. And therefore, our real question is, what is the situation with the United States? Why does the United States support Israel like this, so that other people follow the example of the United States? So what is it? What's it about? I would be no exaggeration to tell you that many people have tried to understand this. Many people, and it is a subject of inquiry and controversy. So let me give you two schools of thought, if you like. The first school of thought says that the United States is an imperial power. It's imperialist. It's dominant in the world. It wishes to maintain its dominance in the countries of the world. Now, Israel acts as the agent for the United States. So America can't itself be seen to, interfere or intervene or penetrate many places, whereas Israel can, on behalf of the United States. People have pointed to particularly dictatorial and nasty regimes as the ones in many Latin American countries, the ones in some African countries, which the United States doesn't want to be seen to be propping up or supporting openly. Now, Israel does that. So in this view and in this school of thought, Israel is working for the United States, if you like. And in return for its work, it is remunerated by fantastic funding, armaments, diplomatic support, etc. That's a school of thought, and it's an important school of thought. And you can argue it, and you can think about it. What's the evidence, and does it really look as if it's likely? Many people think it is. Okay, now the second school of thought says that it's really to do with the pro-Israel lobby in the United States, which is very well organized, very wealthy, and very clever. And that this lobby in the United States, there is, of course, a very big organization called AIPAC, which I think you might have heard of. That is a lobby, a big Jewish lobby organization. Anyway, these groups have made it their business to influence and infiltrate government, the US government, on the basis that if you can control the government or make inroads into the decision making of the government, it's great. You've got it made. So on this basis, these groups have been shown. I mean, there's a lot of evidence that, of course, they, because of funding, they are able to fund many candidates for Congress and to help them in their campaigns to get elected. in return for, of course, supporting Israel. And the converse is true. That is, if you, as a congresswoman, man or woman, stand up and criticize Israel, you will find that your funding will be withdrawn and you will be ostracized, you will become the object of a campaign against you, etc. So, this school of thought says that the Israel lobby is able to make and unmake members of Congress, and it's able to influence and dominate through them the political process, so that votes in the House of Representatives can go Israel's way, and votes which would and motions which would have criticized Israel are made to fail, etc. I can't really tell you definitively whether this school or that school are the ones who got it right. Clearly, there must be a bit of both, if you like. That makes sense that there's a bit of both going on here. But I think the point of contention has been, how much is there of both? That is it more to do with imperialist designs by the United States in which Israel serves a purpose, or is it to do with really the power of this lobby? It's something you need to think about and make up your own minds.
Thank you very much. I think that was a very nice answer. I wanted to ask you because you are you are a former lecturer at the University of Exeter, and following what happened recently to Shahid Abu Salama at the Sheffield Hallam University, did you experience any struggle because like being a Palestinian in the academics, for example, or for example, like Shahad, she has been targeted because she is a Palestinian activist. So did you experience any of this? Thank you.
I was no. Exeter, by the way, is quite famous for being pro-Palestinian. It has a very active Palestine society, and the academic staff were generally very friendly, very sympathetic. Many of our students were themselves either Arabs or Muslims or Palestinians. And so I never actually experienced that, except once. I had 1 year, one undergrad, I was taught undergraduates, one undergraduate year, very strange. It had a number of pro-Zionists. I don't know whether they were Jewish or not. That doesn't matter, because if they're pro-Zionist, it doesn't really matter. And they had it in for me. And I remember how very unpleasant it was. But I never at all remember now this whole thing, this whole issue of anti-Semitism. Because remember, Shahid is sort of the victim of these slurs and accusations, is something more recent. I mean, by the time I'd finished teaching at Exeter, this whole anti-Semitism business hadn't really got off. It really got off with Jeremy Corbyn. Not because he was anti-Semitic, certainly not, but because the campaign against him used anti-Semitism as a weapon against him, and very much created this whole hoo-ha around anti-Semitism. And that is something that is very much a real problem today. So Shad became the victim of this witch hunt, as I call it. But I'm very glad she was reinstated, as you know, I think. She was reinstated, and all is well in in the university.
I think, thank you very much. That was very nice, and yeah. So we don't have any other question, I think, in the comment section. So Monty, if you have any question.
Thank you. I do. Just because a lot of viewers watching are students and they are part of our Palestine societies. When it comes to student activism, do you have any like suggestions or advice for us, or how we can become even stronger allies? I feel like with the whole marches in the summer and how societies have been doing more for Palestine, and again what happened with the lecture and all of that, I feel like we're going towards a positive route. But how do we make sure we're like as strong as possible and can kind of help further the cause?
Yeah, sure. And that's a very, very important issue. It's a message for all students, and for all activists. Don't be put off by this horrible witch hunt against people who support Palestine. More than ever today, we have an atmosphere in this country where attempts are being made to make Palestine itself anti-Semitic. It's ridiculous, but to talk about Palestine is apparently anti-Semitic, and to support the Palestinians is anti-Semitic. So more than ever now, we need to be strong. We need to have nothing to do with this nonsense, and to call it nonsense, and be fearless. Don't be intimidated, and push on. Continue your work, your meetings, lectures, whatever it is you might decide to do. Just go on with it as if none of this was happening. It's so important, not just for the cause in this country, but for them over there. They know about this, and it's so supportive for them. It's so heartening to see people who care, who want to support them, who speak out in a way that they can't. And that's very important. Now, that sounds like an overall message, if you like. That should be the thrust of it. But you also need to be clever. Don't fall into traps which the other side sets. Always make sure that you're talking about Israel, that you're talking about Israeli policy, that you're talking about what Israel is doing to the Palestinians. Nothing to do, no Jews, no mention of Jews, none of that. That's what they're waiting for, to trip you up. And so we need to be very, very clear that what we're talking about is a state, the policies of a state, the army of a state, you see, and the fact, so that's on the one hand. Now, the other thing that I want to also suggest is, apart from being activists and holding meetings and so on and so forth, which is very good, but do be aware that there are other avenues in a democratic society. Writing letters, criticizing people who are behaving in a way which is hostile to the Palestine cause. You can do that not just by meetings and talks. You can actually write. There must be a student newspaper at your university, isn't there? A student.
I'm not sure. Maybe you mean Ali Milani, probably.
No. A newspaper. There must be a university student, a newspaper, a local news, a university newsletter, something like that. No?
Probably. I'm not aware of it, unfortunately.
Okay. Well, you need to look for things like that, because you can then write in that, and it can be circulated. It's good. And don't forget your MPs. You may be students, but you've got an MP,
Yeah.
and so please be active in that. Just get onto your MP and protest and criticize and put your point of view across. And of course, for those of you who are able to or can consider it, write in the local press, write in the national press. I mean, letters. So I suppose what I'm trying to say is there's many ways to protest in a democratic society, and you should use all of them to support the Palestinians.
Yeah, thank you very much. Actually, our MP at our university and our small city, Uxbridge, it's Boris Johnson. So
That's excellent. You
yeah,
absolutely should be lobbying him all the
yeah.
time.
He
Good,
usually comes to our university, so we make sure to be there and show
good,
him
good.
our voice.
Good, good, good. You don't need me to give you any advice at all. That's very good news.
That's good.
Right. Okay.
Okay, so Monty, she wanted to speak about the amnesty.
Thank you so much for the great tips. And this will be our last question. Thank you so much for giving up your time. I just wanted to see if you had any remarks or like after. So recently, the Amnesty recognized Israel as an apartheid state. I was just wondering what that kind of means for us and how that kind of helps our cause. And if you had any kind of comments on that.
Look, the Amnesty report is a landmark. We have to be very clear. This isn't just another report. This is Amnesty. Now, the Zionists have always tried to dismiss. There are earlier reports, about apartheid in Israel, but they managed to dismiss them. They managed to make out that the bodies that have produced them are nothing much, etc. Won't work with Amnesty because Amnesty is too big. Remember, its membership is 10 million people. It's extremely respected. Not only that, but it has a presence in so many countries, and it has the Nobel Prize. It won the Nobel Prize. They can't rubbish it, and so it is really an important study, a report, very important, very supportive of the Palestinians. So you can refer to it. You can always use it's 4 years of study to actually produce it, 4 years of research. So it's got a lot of findings. It's 270, 280 pages. You can find quotes, you can find examples, use it as a reference, and quote it in anything that you write or you complain. You say, but now Amnesty has shown that Israel oppresses the Palestinians by operating an apartheid system. And there is, of course, another way in which I just wish more people, and I'm not getting at you at all, your students, but, as a general piece of advice, people need much more, I think, to criticize those who support Israel. You see what I mean? We can, of course, criticize Israel and Zionism and the Zionists, but actually, if you think about it, we're not living anywhere near there. We're living in Britain. Why does the British government, why would a British government support an apartheid state? Why do those people who defend Israel, what are they actually defending? What, they're defending apartheid? They're defending oppression. They are defending killers, child killers, people who put children in jail. What kind of people are these? So my point is that you can widen the circle, because the people who support Israel, you can imagine, are nearly as bad as Israel. Why would you support a place like that? Why would you support something like this? It's something that's been a bee in my bonnet, personally, for many years, because I've always thought that, Israel itself would never have amounted to very much if it hadn't been supported. So it's the supporters one needs to sometimes look at and say, what are you supporting? I mean, you need to actually ask them directly. I say, oh, you support Israel. Why? What is it you're supporting about it? What? And then tell them you support child killing, you support imprisonments, you support bombing. Well, so anyway, it's just a thought for you to consider. No, I'm sorry, and because it's the Amnesty report, I'm saying Amnesty, the Amnesty report is your friend in this, because you can cite examples and you know that they're reliable and they're real. You're not having to make anything up. So use it in that way.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Ghada, for your beautiful speech and advices. I think that was very important for us as students.
I agree. I think. Oh, sorry. Continue.
Oh, no, please.
I was going to say, I agree. I think it's really important to question the supporters, because at the beginning, when I didn't really understand the point of protests and going out there and speaking up, I realized that a lot of my close friends felt like they couldn't support the cause because they didn't want to seem anti-Semitic, or my Jewish friends felt like they had an kind of something that they owe Israel as the state for Jewish people. And through our education, through our stories and our social media, a lot of them kind of started supporting the cause and understanding that they don't actually owe anybody. It's kind of breaking down this whole fake narrative that Israel is sharing around. So thank you so much. This has been a great talk. I'm sure we all learned something new. I definitely learned a lot. Thank you for giving up your time and for being an incredible speaker. We're very lucky to have you with us today.
Thank you.
Believe me, it was a pleasure. And I want to just leave the people listening with one thought. If you really wanted to know how it felt to be me, read the memoirs, read In Search of Fatima, read Return. It'll tell you an awful lot about how it feels and how it felt.
We will be sharing the links to the books on our social media and our WhatsApp group chats.
Okay,
So
thank
do
you.
read it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ghada.
Okay, assalamu alaikum.
Masalama.
Okay, so thank you everybody for joining today, and yeah, I hope to see you at our next event.
Yep, this has been an incredible first event, and we hope you all have a great evening. Goodbye.